Good morning. Good morning. I am delighted to be with you today. I'm grateful for the invitation and embarrassed it took so long to find a date that would work, but we are finally here and we are together. You know, I describe myself as being in a long-standing flirtation with the UUA. And in part because it strikes me only the UUA has a theological orientation and a self-understanding that can deal with, nurture, and celebrate what is my contradictory, ever-evolving sense of self and theology. You know, I first walked in front of your church summer of 1986. And a lot has changed since then, not just my hairline. A whole lot has changed since then. I arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts to go to divinity school, and I'd picked Harvard for a variety of reasons, none of them having to do with its ability to produce ministers. And that was important for me. I was coming from New York, and prior to New York, I'd been in Buffalo, New York. I moved from Buffalo, New York to New York City. Buffalo was my home, and in Buffalo, three things anchored life for me: family, school, and church. From a very early age, I had made it clear and made it known that I felt some sort of calling to ministry. I wasn't quite certain what that entailed. I wasn't quite certain how I knew that was the case for me, but I made it clear to the pastor that I had a call to preach, and at that point, childhood ended. And that's important because I had spent much of my time as a little dude in this independent black church that became a part of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, oldest black denomination in the country. I'd spent most of my time as a young dude in this church doing a variety of things that weren't worship related. One of my favorite things was the hymnal game. I'd think a number, and I'd close the hymnal, and I'd think that number, and open the hymnal and point. And the purpose of the game was to have that number I thought line up with the number I pointed to in that hymnal. Now, as you might imagine, that game could go on for a very long time, and our worship service were far from short. These were 2.5 hour services, so I had to have games that allowed me to move through this. Another game that I thoroughly enjoyed was go to the bathroom and see how long you can stay away. Right, because that was an opportunity to go explore without adult supervision. I could explore the church, look in its corners, and then explore rooms that I wasn't necessarily supposed to go into, but I'd explore and wait for someone to come and get me. Now, all of that required a great deal of energy, so after that, I would have nap time in the pew. And nap time was followed by hard candy time, right? The church mothers always came with hard candy. So after that nap, I had a piece of hard candy, but as soon as I told the pastor that I had a call to ministry, all of that ended. I was no longer out there in the pew. I was up here in the pulpit. I was lining the hymns. I was opening the doors of the church. And for us, that was a profound moment because that was the moment after the preached word where folks were invited to give themselves to Christ and become a part of this church community. Now, this is a big deal, and this is my world. I slowly moved into sermonic delivery. Yeah, I started giving sermons. Now, I had restrictions. I could not drive a car. I had to be mindful of the street lights coming on because that meant come home. I wasn't old enough to vote, but I'm preaching and working to lead people to Christ. This is something. And my grandmother made it clear. She said she would never use a doctor without an MD, nor would she secure the services of an attorney without a JD, and her grandson would not be an untrained minister. So school was a given. The question was where, and I was evangelical at this point, deeply evangelical at this point. And so for me, the question was, where's the Lord leading? And it just so happened that the new minister at our church in Buffalo had been assigned to a rather large and impressive church in Brooklyn, in Bedford-Stuyvesant. Now, this is not Bedford-Stuyvesant 2023. This is Bedford-Stuyvesant early 80s, as crack cocaine is taking over. Yeah? But I took this as a sign that the Lord wanted me to go to Columbia. And I'd gotten in, and this minister, my father in ministry, was going to be in Brooklyn. This was the place for me. And I was going to Columbia to save it for the Lord, right? I was going to transform this city, yeah? And I encountered people who did not believe what I believed. And that was one thing, but get this. They weren't ashamed, nor were they scared. I talked hell, and it did not bother them at all. I encountered faculty members who understand how this would impact this young evangelical who understood the Bible as just a piece of literature and not necessarily such a great work of literature. And this just floored me. And I'm working as a youth pastor at this church in Brooklyn, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and I'm encountering young people who have an easier time describing their demise than thinking a bright future. And I had nothing to really say that countered that. My faith statements did not blind them to the impact of communities that were struggling economically, segregated socially, and being strangled by crack cocaine and gang activity. I had nothing to give them. And my sense of ministry is evolving because I have nothing to give them, and I'm supposed to. I have nothing to give them that makes life easier. I have nothing to give them that provides them with a way of understanding their circumstances. I had nothing to give them, so my sense of ministry is changing. I went from being deeply evangelical to a kind of social gospel model. I stopped preaching personal salvation. I stopped preaching personal salvation, and I started preaching Christian obligation. You call yourself a Christian, do something in the world that matters. You consider yourself Christ-like, then deal with the kind of folks that Christ dealt with. Do something in the world that mattered. But I still had more questions than I had answers, and folks at this church needed Reverend Pinn to have answers, not questions. Now, I'm still committed to ministry, but a very different sense of ministry, a very, very different sense of ministry. And I knew I could not train for ministry in New York City because the people I knew there needed me to have answers, and I just had questions. And I needed to be in a place where questions mattered, where preparation for ministry was in the catalog, but it was not the priority. So I packed up and moved to Cambridge, Harvard Divinity School, and I'd pass by your church regularly. I didn't have a lot of money, but you can walk Cambridge for free, and I found it fascinating because you could make a series of turns and not know where you were going to end up. I'd come from New York, and New York is on a grid. You knew if you made a right turn, then a left turn, you had some sense of where you'd end up, but there was just something magical about the layout of your streets here, and I could just walk for hours and think, and this was significant for me. And I'm thinking through what it means to be in ministry, and my theology is evolving, that it's no longer about personal salvation, that I no longer have any concern with a personal sense of sin. This is irrelevant to me, and I'm working at a church in Roxbury, right? Because if you're a Master of Divinity student, you have to do field education. I'm working in Roxbury, and it's across the street from a park, but don't think a place for play. Drug deals, prostitution. And I asked the pastor in charge of this church, Doc, what are we going to do about this? How do we respond? And his response to me was, let the people get happy with you. Happy about what? Their children were literally dying, and I had nothing good to say. Pray about it. The Lord will make a way. And they're attending funerals. And it reached a point where I had to make a decision. Was I going to safeguard a tradition that I no longer held as true? Or was I going to break away and think new thoughts? So I contacted the pastor in charge of the church and told him I would not be coming back. I contacted the bishop who was in charge of my ordination and told him that I was surrendering ordination, that I could not do this anymore. Things changed for me, yeah? Things changed for me, but some things remained the same. For example, anti-black racism continued to thrive. Regardless of what this country said about itself, anti-black racism continued to thrive. I continued to encounter young people who had an easier time describing their demise than thinking of future. And it wasn't because they didn't have capacity, but they lived in the context of a country that thought less of them. This did not change. I had grown up believing that the civil rights movement made a difference, and there are certain dimensions of that civil rights movement that are responsible for me being who I am, where I am, doing what I do. But I was finding it difficult to maintain the kind of optimism embedded in this movement. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. This is what Dr. King told us, but I'm reaching a point where that isn't comfortable for me. I cannot say that. What I can say is the arc of the moral universe is long. Drop the mic, that's the end. This is changing for me, and I'm trying to think of ways to find meaning in a world that seems meaningless, to find answers in a world that seems deadly opposed to providing any answers. I'm wrestling with this, trying to make sense of it, but the old way in which I thought as an evangelical no longer worked for me. I was no longer an evangelical. I came to name myself a humanist. I could not say much about vertical relationships. I could not say much about these vertical relationships, but there was much I needed to say about these horizontal relationships, how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to others, the material and messy nature of life. I needed to be able to say something to that. Vertical relationships, I don't know. But this, yes, I needed to be able to say something about the material circumstances of our existence. The vertical no. Horizontal, I needed to be able to say something that was true to our experience. Yeah, so I started to think there's got to be a central question that I ask, a central question that might make sense for us to ask. What do our circumstances authorize us to say? What do our circumstances authorize us to say? Much had changed for me. Early on, you might describe my orientation as healthy-minded, right? Think in terms of William James and healthy-mindedness. For him, healthy-mindedness, these are folks who move through a messy world, but they're able to see the bright side. They're kind of fixated with the brightness, with possibilities. This was my evangelical thinking, right? I'm moving through the world. It's a messy, messy place. But God is on the throne and all is well. This is not the final statement. There's something else. We simply have to keep our eyes on the prize and not get distracted by the messy stuff in this world. This is temporary, but relationship with God is forever. I shifted from that to what you might call what I would call the sick soul. And you might think that William James is privileging the healthy-minded, just the nature of that language. But for him, no, it's this other orientation that is more meaningful, has more oomph to it. This is the person who moves through the world and cannot lose sight of those who are suffering. Is always aware of the misery in the world, always aware of the pain in the world, and unwilling to ignore it. Who encounters what's taking place in the world without flinching, without blinking, is committed to already and always understanding the misery we encounter in the world. And what do these circumstances authorize us to say? You know, I have two really good friends. I've never met them in person, but we communicate on occasion. One of them is Job's wife, and the other is Sisyphus. Now, you might be familiar with the book of Job, but don't think of the book of Job from the perspective of Job. And don't think of the book of Job from the perspective of the divine. Let's think about the story of Job from the perspective of Job's wife. From my vantage point, she is the only one in the story with any integrity. She is the only one in the story who is concerned with the when, where, and how of human existence. Yeah? Who is preoccupied with our circumstances. Right? God has had a conversation with this other force, and this force has said, I've just been roaming around, just doing what I do, just looking around, and God says, look, have you checked out Job? And this other force says, okay, Job, yeah, whatever. You're right. You give Job all this wonderful stuff. Of course Job is with you. And God says, God's thinking about this. Does Job really love me for me? There's a kind of ego-driven conversation taking place. Yeah, and this force says, but if you were to take this stuff away from Job, if you were to take this stuff away from Job, Job would curse you to your face. God gives authority. You do whatever you need to Job, but you cannot kill Job. So Job is losing everything that's of value. He loses property, whatever, but he loses his children. They're taken for no good reason. They're hanging out, they're celebrating life, and they're taken away. Job's body turns on him. And Job is rejected by his own body, and his wife is seeing all this, and we fail to recognize that Job's loss is also Job's wife's loss. Those were her children. Those were her children. She had labored with Job to get all of this wonderful stuff. It wasn't just Job. Those were her children. That was her house. Those were her crops. That was her cattle. She was in this with Job. And it's all gone. And Job's friends, I hope you never have friends like Job's friends. Right? Their attitude is, Job, you must have done something wrong. We just need to figure out how you screwed up, because you clearly have, right? I mean, this is a conversation that is not nurturing for Job, and Job's wife finally says, enough is enough. Job, just curse God and die. Now, most conversations concerning Job's wife, extremely critical of this move on her part. Yeah, from St. Augustine moving forward, extremely critical of Job's wife in making this statement. For me, there is something about human integrity there. The question I have, what do our circumstances authorize us to say? Job's wife gives us a hint at this. Job's wife says, curse God and die. Now, be mindful. The one thing God says can't happen to Job is death. Job's wife says, curse God and die. This gives Job the oomph to raise radical questions, right? It's after Job's wife has this short conversation with him that Job has the capacity to ask God the tough questions. It seems to me Job's wife is not saying that this sort of resistance to wrongdoing, a recognition of wrongdoing, and a stance against it, a kind of symbolic no to misery, wins the day. But it says something about our humanity. It says something about our connection to this larger web of life. It grounds us in a way that is nurturing. Job's wife says, curse God and die. If you cannot live in a way that is productive in the context of this absurd world, at the very least, you get to determine how you leave it, right? Be mindful. This is the one thing that God said can't happen. This is what that force cannot do to Job. That force cannot end Job's life. But Job's wife says, look, if you can't make sense of any of this, if you cannot determine the conditions of one existence, perhaps the last marker of your humanity, the last marker of your oomph, your significance in the world is the ability to determine when it ends. I think that's rather uncomfortable. In part because it doesn't go with the traditional narrative. But then there's my dude, my friend Sisyphus, right? And this dude was a king of Corinth, who cheated death twice. Job's wife knows something about death, and Sisyphus cheats death twice, not once. Cheats death twice. And what is Sisyphus' punishment? Big rock that has to be rolled up a hill. And that's one thing, right? There's some labor involved in that. But as the story goes, the rock does what? It comes back down. And that's not the end of it, right? The gods have not said, Sisyphus, you do that 500 times and you're done. This is forever. He pushes that rock up. It pauses for a moment, and then it comes back down. And what is Sisyphus' victory? If you take seriously the philosopher, the moralist, Albert Camus, the victory for Sisyphus is in his willingness to be persistent, his awareness of his circumstances, and his unwillingness to be defeated by those circumstances. The gods don't win. They don't win because Sisyphus is sure. It's not about ending that struggle. It's about finding something of ourselves in that struggle. What do our circumstances authorize us to say? And you pick your point of misery. Perhaps it's not anti-black racism for you. Maybe it's transphobia. Maybe it's sex. You pick your misery. The United States has enough to choose from. You pick your misery and ask the question, what do our circumstances authorize us to say? I think my two friends provide us with something to work with. It seems to be both Job's wife and Sisyphus urge us to move away from outcome-driven strategies. We do this in the world because we know it will produce X, Y, and Z. We push for justice because we know at the end of the day we will get there. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, and I wonder if our circumstances really allow for that. Many of my friends say, T, you are just crazy. You know, this just makes no sense. We've had a black president. We certainly have, but that black president was followed by Donald Trump. And my friends say, look, we just have to get this thing right. Democracy can work for us. We have just never applied it in the way that was intended. And that's one way to interpret it, but it seems to me you can also make a reasonable argument that the misery, the death we encountered, is not democracy not working, that this is the way it was intended to deal with difference. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, these are not democracy misbehaving. This is democracy, our country working as intended. And so, what do our circumstances authorize us to say? Now, I have to reassure you, this is not a push towards nihilism. This is not a kind of simple pessimism. I would argue that it's a kind of realism. What do our circumstances allow us to say? And it seems to me, as I hear my friends Job's wife and Sisyphus arguing, it does not support outcome-driven strategies. Because the forms of misery we push against remain with us. It's no safer to be a black man in 2023 than it was to be in 1950. I come here and I'm no longer afraid to go to South Boston or Charlestown. But that's not a safeguard of blackness, that's just gentrification. Forms of misery remain with us. And so how do we behave in the world? What do our circumstances authorize us to say? Over against outcome-driven strategies, which has been our approach, we march because it will make a difference. Yeah? We protest because it will make a difference. I suggest this, the unjustified because. We push against misery, we push against pain, we push against injustice, not because our effort will win the day, but simply because it's what we can do. It's what's available to us. We do it not because we will necessarily win, but because it's what we can do. And perhaps there's something, just perhaps there's something in our no to the circumstances that we encounter, just something about us saying no to it that forms and shapes and nurtures our humanity and our connections to the larger web of life. It's not whether we win, but our commitment to saying no to injustice. That is our win. If there is anything called a victory, perhaps it's in the volume with which we say no to injustice and the persistence with which we say no to injustice. This is what I hear in Job's wife. And I think this is how Albert Camus responds to Sisyphus. At the end of this short essay, in the myth of Sisyphus and other essays, he ends with these words. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. What can we say? What are we authorized to say in light of our circumstances? It seems to me what we are authorized to say is no to injustice, and say it as loudly as we can and as persistently as we can. And perhaps in that is something of our humanity. Perhaps in that is our victory. Thank you.